Catherine Duncan Jones, that's, you know, it's very readable. It's the kind of thing you can, you know, read while eating an apple and lying on the sofa, which I think is the test for everything. There's another one by Alan Stewart, which is also very good. They have the same cover. The same picture of Sydney is on the cover of both, which makes it a bit confusing, but really they're both terribly good. Yes.
Okay, another question. Is there a chance a woman might have had fencing lessons, or is that too Game of Thrones? I love the pop culture references. They're coming through thick and fast.
I actually cut a Game of Thrones reference out of this talk because it's beneath my dignity, isn't it? I'm so glad. Okay, well, look, the problem is it wouldn't have been recorded because it would have been such a very problematic thing to do. Though I am absolutely certain that there were little girls who, so little boys were wearing dresses, you know, until they were breached when they were about sort of 7, and they moved out of the women's domain, and their hair was cut and they were put into trousers and they were given a sword. But I can't imagine that they weren't playing with swords before that. Going by my 4-year-old, who has been wedded to his foam sword for a very, very long time now, and whose greatest delight is biffing things with it. I can't imagine that if he hadn't been part of a family with little girls as well, they wouldn't all have been biffing each other with sticks. I'm sure that girls were taught, but I am afraid unless we find a letter seems the likeliest thing in which someone makes a reference to it, we're not going to find it out, because it just would not have been respectable. It would have been worse than wearing your hair down in public. It would have been a very transgressive thing to do, to admit to, but I'm certain it happened.
No, okay. Are there any books or articles you could recommend about the history of fencing and the transition from broadsword to the rapier? No pressure, off the top of your head.
Well, no, it's there's actually an awful lot of academic interest in this. People really like the idea of fencing, don't they? It's very attractive, it's glamorous. So I'm just looking around my desk to see. There's a very sort of readable one called, oh yes, here we go. Is this reversed as you see it? It says
no, it's the right way around.
Richard Cohen, By the Sword, and that's the most kind of generally available kind of, you'll buy it in a bookshop one. There are some very good academic studies, but they are so expensive and so difficult to come by that I just, you know, I think unless you're prepared to spend several £100s, I think this tells you all the things you need to do. He has read all those academic books and he puts it all in, and it's really fun. He's a fun writer. So I recommend him.
Are there records of women in armies as there are in the 18th century?
There must have been some women in armies, but the records of anybody in armies are very poor unless you are an aristocrat, and aristocratic women were not the ones who were joining armies at any point, were they? You know, it was always enlisted. It was always among the men, among the soldiers hiding out. So no, I'm afraid not. But you know, they don't bother to record the names of the people who are fighting anyway. So I think it quite likely that some women, there were women who were camp followers, but there must have been women who were also involved in the fighting. Yes.
And another question. That chat's moving really fast. Was access to weapons limited by class?
Well, now this is a really interesting one. So I went into this understanding that the sumptuary laws, which were about what you were allowed to wear by class, said that you were only allowed to carry a sword if you bore arms, which is to say, if you were a gentleman whose coat of arms was registered in the College of Heralds. However, I came across an account from a French visitor to England in the 1570s who said, they're all bristling with weapons here. When the farmers go into the field to cut down the crops, they leave their swords and bucklers in the corner of the field. So I think that there was a lot of flouting of that particular rule. Maybe not somewhere like London where there might have been people moderating it, but I think that in the country, you know, you had a sword. It mightn't have been a very trendy sword. It might have been, I think a lot of the weapons were ancient. This is one of the things that's really interesting. You see these accounts from people gathering up weapons at the time of a muster or a weapon show, like the one with the shooting of the Pappenjay. And people are coming out with things that are very medieval. They've been, their great grandfather's sword has been preserved in the family, which actually doesn't surprise me, because when my great aunts died, and we sort of had a bit of a poke around the house, we opened a wardrobe and found that it was full of weapons from the Irish Civil War, which admittedly happened in the 1920s, but still, you don't expect a wardrobe full of guns, do you? But their father had been a commander, and he'd never handed them in. Trish, is this being recorded? I shouldn't have said that.
We don't know which aunts, we don't know where they were. It's a different country. You'll be
different. I've made that bit up, actually. That's a fictional account based on something in the 16th century. But yes, so what was it? Yeah, so I think weapons were around. I think people hung them up on the wall. You took down a pike. There are interesting court cases that describe how fights started, and people will say, well, I heard a disturbance on the street, so I grabbed the halberd from over the fireplace and I ran out. So even if it wasn't a sword, they had weapons.
Narwhal horns, whatever comes to hand, really.
And it is worth saying, I'm sure everyone's seen, some version of a film of Robin Hood where he and Little John fight with long staffs at some point in the film. People, when they were walking, did have these very long staffs, which were tipped with metal and which were used as weapons as well. So you always had something.
Okay, more questions. Blimey, the technical one. Okay, can you speak briefly about the parallel transition of armour, as with from broadsword to rapier? Did that have impact on the armour?
Okay, I'm not an expert on armour, but here's what I would say. The rapier is generally not used in situations where people wear armour. It's to do with speed and lightness. So they weren't wearing armour. They might have had a padded, their clothes were very padded, so that might have been what they relied on. Whereas the broadsword was something where you were slower moving and you were fighting with some sort of armour, if you could arrange it to be so. But there's a sort of transitional period where they're fighting with a little shield called the buckler, the sword and buckler. And those illustrations don't show men in armor. They show people using the little shield as a kind of weapon to biff, but no helmets, no armor in particular. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's not a very technical answer, is it? But I mean, certainly, the changes that armor goes through over the long period from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance is really interesting. People had full suits of armor because they did pretend jousting. Philip Sidney was a very successful pretend jouster, and Elizabeth I really encouraged this kind of medieval tradition of people dressing up in armor and jousting on her birthday. But he was killed by a bullet. So he was really good at jousting in armor, and when he went into battle at Zutphen, he took his thigh armor off his legs because his soldiers didn't have armor, and he felt that it was unsporting to have better protection than they did. He got shot in the thigh and died. So armor mattered for a lot longer than you might think.
And point just come in the painting, Sidney's only wearing armor around his throat. Could these facts be related?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I think it's a gesture. You see that in 18th century uniforms as well. And this is just me speculating wildly. But sort of, you wear a little bit of armor as a kind of symbol that you're an officer, and it's a very reduced kind of gesture towards the bigger breastplate that you would have worn in battle.
That shows off your fancy doublet a bit better.
Yeah, probably. But in battle, he should have worn more armor than that.
You'd hope. Is St. Mary's a mercenary army typical of the time?
There were a lot of mercenary armies. Italy, in particular, was a place famous for very accomplished mercenary armies. And I think that we don't hear so much of it. There were mercenaries who were brought in to fight in Scotland, but we don't hear of anything quite so professional as one of the Italian-style mercenary armies, except obviously for St. Mary's, which is poorly documented, but...
Too busy to do the paperwork. One point of clarification. You mentioned that stages were built size-wise to accommodate rapier fighting. Is that?
Well, this is a speculation. The Curtain Theatre has been excavated very recently, and this is the discovery they've made, that it's the right size for fencing as set out in fencing handbooks of the period. And we know that the plays that were put on there were the ones that are very heavy in fighting. So so it seems that it's a kind of fair extrapolation to make. Yeah. It's a much longer stage than is usual. The Globe had a much smaller stage than that. So why did you need so much space all of a sudden? Well, you know, I think they were probably doing fighting exhibitions as well when they weren't performing plays.
So was there a Scottish or English code of gestures as there was in Italy? So like a dictionary?
You're frozen.
Jenny, I'm so sorry. I've lost you there for a minute. But let me see. Was there a Scottish or English code of gestures as in Italy, a code of rude gestures? Yeah, I think so. I think people talked a lot more with their hands. I think when you're sort of corseted or sort of fastened into a doublet, you wave your hands around more, which frees up the idea of the hand for insulting gestures. But I think that yeah, there's a good account of them in. Ruth Goodman wrote a book about being rude in the Renaissance, and I think that's I can't rival that account.
Jenny, are you still with us?
Poor Jenny. This is what happens when I can read the questions. Let me see. Yes, Claudia is absolutely right. Carrying swords and etiquette, absolutely. Officer cadets at the Royal Military Academy, where, yeah, exactly, it's the last vestiges of armour. I think you get a lot of cadet schools actually will do the same thing. So my father had the same thing in Ireland, that it is that little gesture towards remembering